Hello, this is Mike Corrali with the Introduction to United States Government course online. Welcome. I'm so glad to have you here today. Today we're looking at Chapter 3 in our book, Bards et al., American Government and Politics Today, titled Federalism. As we've discussed several times, this is the second part of a two-part lecture wherein the Constitution and federalism as an element of the system of government is explored. As I will suggest, our seminar question, then, continues from last week's, which is, how and why was the U.S. Constitution created? As we have in Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, this lecture was recorded in front of a live class to give you, the online student, the feel for sitting in a classroom, hearing other students ask questions and me attempting to answer them. So again, welcome. Thrilled to have you here. Class is about to begin. Please take your seat and let's get started. Federalism, Chapter 3 in Barbara Bards et al., American Government and Politics Today, is our lecture for this evening. And as we're wont to do, I start with a roadmap, yes, of what it is that we're going to be examining. So what we're going to do tonight is federalism defined. We're going to look at the political and philosophic context of federalism. We're going to look at founders' intent, as we're usually want to do. We're going to look at Federalist theory. We're going to define what a theory is in political science and how we can use it to understand federalism. We're going to talk about three types of federal systems and examine them in depth. We're going to look at 6 key characteristics that define a federal union. We're going to look at 7 powers inherent in the Constitution and their relation to federalism. We're going to look at models of federalism. We're going to look at fiscal federalism. This is F-I-S-C-A-L, fiscal as in relating to money, not physical federalism, but fiscal federalism. And we're going to look at the bamboo fence model, which is an exercise to help us understand fiscal federalism, or what happens to federalism when you throw a really big bag of money at it. All right? And then we'll conclude with current topics in federalism. So there isn't a seminar question for Chapter 3 as there is for 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, and 7. I would argue that tonight's lecture should inform part of last week's seminar question. Last week's seminar question was on the Constitution. And one of the elements of that seminar question was to define aspects of the government under the Constitution. And I argued that the federal model, the choice of the federal model, was a big part of the government and how it was structured, right? Because the Madisonian model rests on the notion of balance of power, not only among the 3 branches of government, but bringing in the states as well, right? And so tonight's lecture should write paragraphs 6 and 7-ish of last week's seminar question, the one on the Constitution. You should be able to take tonight's lecture and plug it in nicely to kind of fill that out and to give it more depth. Finally, we'll look at current topics in federalism. We'll look at the newspaper today and see what the current political topics are and how they relate to federalism. So everybody on the road with me? Going to go down the primrose path? So we are going to define our terms, right? So where does this word federalism comes from? Well, it comes to us in the English via the French from the original Latin foederatus, meaning bound by treaty, or deriving from foedus, Latin for treaty, and fidere, to trust. And so bound by treaty, bound by trust is the core meaning of the term federalism. And so a good mnemonic or a good way to remember federalism is this image, which is a fasci, F-A-S-C-E-S. And this is the root of the term fascist that you may have heard of. And the fascists were a party pre-World War II in Italy that were hearkening back to the glory days of Italy, the glory days of Rome, not the Roman Empire, but the Roman Republic. This is a symbol of the Roman Republic. And here's how it describes federalism. It's a bundle of sticks gathered together and tied together by a red ribbon. Although you might not be able to clearly see it, there's an axe head emanating from the bundle of sticks. So this was a symbol, it was an icon that was carried in front of a Roman senator as he progressed through the streets as a symbol of his office, yes? And so what it shows then is strength through numbers. And here we're representing the provinces and the people of Rome. The people of Rome coming together, being bound together by the Senate. The Senate is represented by the red ribbon. The senators wore a red piping on the edges of their toga to signify their office. And so the red represents the Senate. So the Senate and the people of Rome, this federation, this coming together, this bound by trust. And it's both defensive, because we know the old adage that it's easy to break a stick, but when you get a bundle of sticks together, it's much, much harder to break, just like a pencil, right? A bundle of pencils is very hard to break. Same thing. So it's a defensive mechanism, but it's also an offensive mechanism. Now, the axe head is symbolic of martial authority or military might. And so we have military might by virtue of our coming together. So our strength isn't just defensive, it's also offensive. So the fasci might help you remember the root of federalism, or bound by treaty, bound by trust. The textbook definition of federalism is really quite simple. It's a system of government, so it's not an ideology per se. Right? This isn't classic liberalism. This isn't socialism. Federalism is a system of government. It's a way to organize government in which functions, what government does, are constitutionally divided between a central governing authority and its constituent political units. The root of constituent, well, the extrapolation of constituent is belonging to the Constitution. Constituent signs on to the Constitution. So these are political units that are in the Constitution or agree to the Constitution. Okay, so that's the textbook definition, right? Federalism is a system of government in which functions are constitutionally divided between a central governing authority and constituent political units. Any questions thus far? Next, then, we're going to introduce the idea of theory in political science. Now, I know it's PowerPoint and not power paragraph, but I try to get a lot onto this. A theory, just like in natural sciences, is held true in social sciences or in political science, in history, sociology, psychology. It's a logically interrelated set of propositions about empirical reality. A theory is an interrelated set of statements expressing judgment about things that we observe. So this is what I see. This is what I think I see. That's a theory. And so a theory can be used to define. It can introduce items that refer to the basic concepts of the theory. The theory that people are late for class because they're trying to find parking is an empirical observation. It's what I observe, it's what I think, but am I able to prove it? The way to prove it is to quantify it and to go to the people who are late and say, why were you late? Was it because you, see? So a theory then needs to be backed up by collecting quantitative or numbering evidence, verifiable evidence. It gives us functional relationships. Theories are sentences that relate the basic concepts to each other. Within these we have, for example, assumptions, things that are accepted as true, or axioms, things that are self-evident. So it's accepted as true that parking is often hard to get on campus. It's also self-evident that if you're walking in late, the problem might have been you have trouble parking. Because the assumption I hold is true, then the axiom, the self-evidency of if this is true, then you must be late because of that, is a reasonable assumption. This can also be true of deduction or deducing, to conclude by reasoning, or a hypothesis, which is a proposed explanation based on limited evidence. So again, this is trying to explain the idea of a theory, right? Looking at empirical evidence, things that I see, and trying to explain why they are.
They correlate.
They do correlate.
But there's no evident causation between the two.
Exactly, which is exactly my point, which is why it's a theory. You're making assumptions on empirical evidence, and you're trying to later then pinpoint causation to prove your theory. Exactly. Thank you, Casimir. So, operational definitions, sentences that relate some theoretical statements to a set of possible observations. So, theory then, in political science, taking the way we see things and trying to understand whether they are true or not, trying to quantify why they're true, to use them as examples, as test cases, to see if it holds water. So, there's a method to my madness here, bear with me, right? We're going to be looking at Federalist theory. And a Federalist theory is going to be a statement about the way federalism works, or it should work in a perfect world. And then we'll be able to look at models of federalism in our political system to see if it holds water. If it doesn't hold water, if we're not able to quantify federalism, then we can see why and we can see why not. And that gives us understanding of federalism beyond the original theory. And it may help us quantify then the example, the manifestation that we're using, as perhaps something else. Perhaps it's not pure federalism. Perhaps it's confederalism. Perhaps it's a unitary federalism. You see where I'm going? So this theory then allows us to differentiate, to fine-tune what we're seeing in the world. So again, what theories do, or why do we care, especially in political science, they help us classify things, like Federalist theory, elite theory, game theory, feminist theory. We're going to be using a lot of these theories in this class, which is why I wanted to bring this up now and to introduce it. It helps us understand how and why already observed regularities occur. So when a federal model works like we think a federal model should, we have Federalist theory to point to as an explanation of why it is working. If it isn't working, perhaps it's something about the manifestation that isn't truly federal, that is perhaps confederal or unitary, and so it doesn't fit into our examination. It helps us predict as yet unobserved relationships. By looking more deeply, in this case at federalism, perhaps we can see relations between the federal and the states, or between the states and the cities and counties, that by virtue of not having examined the theory, we may not have seen before. So it gives us a deeper, more thorough understanding of what it is that we're looking at. It's a guide to research, right? It tells us where we might be looking for evidence, for quantifiable evidence, where we can go to examine federalism more deeply, or feminism more deeply, and to understand it more fully. And it serves as a basis for action. If then we think we're in a federal model and it doesn't fit federal theory, why? What is it about the model, the manifestation, that might be changed? Perhaps we're skewing toward a unitary system and we don't realize it. Unless we have a pure reason of federalism, we won't understand when we're skewing off. We won't be able to ascertain or quantify when we're skewing off. Okay, so remember when we were talking about the Anti-Federalists last week, and I showed you 4 of their titles, 4 of the Anti-Federalist titles. One of them was, central government will ultimately subvert state authority, right? And so what this is then is trying to ascertain if federalism, pure federalism, constitutionally defined responsibilities still holds true, or if federal authority has indeed subverted state authority. Here it is, the big puppy itself, right? Federalist theory. The case for federalism is advanced by Federalist theory, which argues that federalism provides a robust constitutional system that anchors pluralist democracy and that it enhances democratic participation through providing dual citizenship in a compound republic. Okay, so take a deep breath. Let's dice this and slice this a little bit and see what it is that we're looking at. What is your definition of robust? Anybody? Yes, sir.
Well, in a cooking environment, you're saying it's like a very flavorful or a very
very good.
Bold, if you will. Like, it's got a lot to bring.
It's got a lot of presence, right?
Yeah.
It's very bold, it's very strong, it's very
Yeah.
vital, right?
Yes.
And you may be referring to a commercial that's
Probably.
probably before your guys' time. Anybody remember this? It was about spaghetti sauce, and they said it was robusto. They used the Italian, right? And it was, this was in the 60s. Okay, I know. But you remember it, right? Okay, good. Robusto. So everybody was running around with this robust word on their lips. We don't use it so much anymore. But this is right. So what it is it provides a robust, a strong, a vital, a flavorful, a powerful system, a constitutional system, or a system that is run through constitutional means, right, that anchors pluralist democracy. Now, we know we're in a republic and not in a democracy, but we said that democracy is a part of our Republican model, yes? Okay, so we did this last week where we differentiated republicanism, or living by the rule of law, as opposed to democracy, which is living by the rule of, or living by majority rule. So we live by law in a republic. And so we have this pluralist democracy that is an element of our Republican system of government. Democracy is the voices of the people, the participation of the people in this constitutional system. But here's the thing. It anchors pluralist democracy. It not just allows it, it not just humors pluralist democracy, it anchors it. It gives it a place to be. It makes sure that it exists. Pluralist democracy. The more voices, the better. The more conversation, the more discussion, the more vibrancy we have in our political discourse, the better. So this federal model actually promotes, it anchors pluralist democracy. It enhances democratic participation. It doesn't just allow it to be, it improves it by providing dual citizenship in a compound republic. So, you need go no further than your paycheck and look at the deductions, right? The tax deductions to see where your taxes are going. You're going to be paying federal taxes, you're going to be paying state taxes, and most likely you're going to be paying some kind of city or county tax, a small part of it, right? And so by virtue of paying taxes, this is the responsibility, the obligation of a citizen. Right? You're paying taxes, you're supporting the state, the central government. It's also evidence of you being a citizen in that it gives you your place in civil society. You are a citizen both of the United States, to whom you pay taxes, and to the state of California, to whom you pay taxes, right? Now, this is evidenced through the franchise. You can vote for the central government's representatives, for your senator, for your representative, toward the electoral college for the president, right? And you can vote at the local level, at the state level, for your state assembly person, your state senator, the governor, the other 6 constitutional officers. You can vote for your mayor and your city council. You can vote for your school. You see what I mean? So by virtue of having this dual citizenship, your democratic participation is actually increased. It's enhanced. If we only had a unitary government, if we only had a central government, if you only had one vote, then your vote is lessened from this federal model whereby you have 2, state and central. Does that make sense? Yes, sir.
So we are part of the Federalist government? Then?
Oh, yes.
All right.
Absolutely. We are indeed part of the Federalist model. And so, before we go on, then, I want to underscore some of the allusions that I've been yammering around, which are the political and philosophic context of federalism. So the founding generation, especially Madison, right, the father of the Constitution, didn't just pull this out of the air, this idea of a federal model. It was actually based in political philosophy and evolved primarily from the failure of the Articles of Confederation that we talked about last week. So some of the key thinkers we're going to be looking at tonight are Ludolf, Hugo, and I'll be covering these individually. The Baron de Montesquieu, we talked about him last week, right? Hume, Rousseau, and Kant. Okay, so you with me? So what were these political philosophers saying? We start with Ludolf Hugo, who was the first to distinguish confederations based on alliances. Decentralized unitary states. In this instance, he's writing in 1661, he's looking at the Holy Roman Empire, right? And federations characterized by double governments with a territorial division of powers. And this is in his book, De Statu Regionium Germanae, or the Regional German State, again, 1661. So what the heck is he talking about? You remember George I, when we were talking about the kings and queens of England? You remember George I? I said that when Queen Anne died, the next person who was eligible to the throne was Sophia, Electress of Hanover. She was the first because she was the first Protestant, right? After 65, she was the first that came to the qualification outlined in the 1689 Act of Settlement, right? And so George, her son, was the Elector of Hanover. You remember me making a big deal out of that, right? I said he was the only king that wasn't buried in England. He was buried back in Hanover. He never quite got English. He was always a Hanoverian. And so Brunswick on this map is also known as Hanover, right? And so this is the state, the German state that George is from. So again, we're looking at Ludolf Hugo, and he's examining this Holy Roman Empire. So what is he looking at? He's looking at dual sovereignty, a system of a confederation that he's examining for its political aspects. So the prince, in this instance George, the Elector of Hanover, is the head of a principality. Principality, same root. And so we're looking at these principalities that are independent states, independent sovereign states that come together on a voluntary allegiance to elect their emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, this was rather kabuki theater, right? It was already a done deal. Everybody knew what the outcome was going to be. It was going to be Habsburg, and they were going to be based out of Vienna, right? Everybody knew the Holy Roman Emperor lineage. But nevertheless, these princes voted for their emperor. So they maintained the independence, the sovereignty of their principalities, but because they were so small, they came together in a voluntary association by treaty, right, for common defense and trade. And so Ludolf Hugo is looking at the Holy Roman Empire as an example of an early confederation, right? And examining how it works and what the benefits are to the princes to maintain their sovereignty while still banding together for a stronger common defense, like the bundle of sticks, right? Strength through numbers. Okay. So Ludolf Hugo is first, and then we get Montesquieu in The Spirit of Laws in 1748. Now, we talked about Montesquieu twice already. We talked about him in looking at the Declaration of Independence, and we talked about him when we were looking at the Constitution. And in The Spirit of Laws in 1748 is only 40 years before the Constitution. So this is almost contemporaneous with our founding generation. He argued that confederal arrangements, now confederation is a loose treaty of independent states banding together for common defense, like the Holy Roman Empire and like the United States under the Articles of Confederation. Articles of Confederation. A confederal arrangement ensures the ideal scale of government required for personal liberty, says Montesquieu. He's looking at security against the abuse of power. Montesquieu is all about protecting the liberty of the individual. And we know individualism from our 6 key elements of classic liberalism. Individualism is the self-evident starting off place. So, Madison, the father of the Constitution, used Montesquieu's arguments verbatim, word for word, in the Constitutional Convention. Montesquieu said that a confederate republic with separation of powers secures the requisite homogeneity within sufficiently small subunits where the common good subdues private interests, thus preventing the tyranny of the majority. And so he says smaller units provide the requisite homogeneity, sameness, that within that small unit, people have roughly the same ethnicity, the same language, the same religion, the same culture. And what Montesquieu is saying is those small subunits then, the smaller the better, in order to protect against the abuse of power, to protect individual liberty. Splitting sovereignty between member unit and center also protects the individual's rights against the abuse by authorities at either level, either at the state or at the national level, or so believed Hamilton, who quoted Montesquieu at length to this effect in Federalist 9. 4 years later, David Hume disagreed with Montesquieu. He said that in a large democracy, there is compass and room enough to redefine the democracy. So he's going to say that small isn't better, bigger is better, if you're looking at a federal model to protect individual liberty. In his idea of a perfect commonwealth, 1752, Hume recommended a federal arrangement for deliberation of laws involving both the subunit and the central legislatures. Subunits enjoy several powers and partake in central decisions, but their laws and court judgments can be overruled by the central bodies. So this is a unitary system. And now your book talks about confederal, federal, and unitary. So when you have a stronger central government and weak dependent member states, you're going away from a confederal model into more of a unitary model. Hume held that such a numerous and geographically large system would do better than small cities in preventing decisions based on intrigue, prejudice, or passion against the public interest. It's always about the public interest and personal liberty. Madison and Hamilton, two of the three Federalists writing the Federalist Papers, agreed with Hume that the risk of tyranny by passionate majorities was reduced in larger republics where member units of shared interests could and would check each other. So in Federalist 10, for example, a rage for paper money, for an abolition of debts, for equal division of property, or for any improper or wicked project will be less likely to pervade the whole body of the Union than a particular member of it. So, noting the problems of allocating powers correctly, Madison supported placing some authority with member units since they could best fit to address local circumstances and lesser interests otherwise neglected by the center, in Federalist number 37. So, if you think about it for a minute, we're getting the best of both worlds. Where Montesquieu says smaller is better, and Hume says larger is better, by having a pure federal model, neither confederal nor unitary, we're taking advantage of both. We have the sufficiently small units in the states, and the large democracy, large enough to encompass many different factions, in the nationwide system. Check? And so we have the best of both Montesquieu and Hume, or so say Madison and Hamilton. You still with me? Sir?
But by giving the government more control of the states, I mean, wouldn't that cause more problems? Because then, let's say you want to do something good or something, or the states.
Yes.
For instance, Washington and Colorado recently legalized the use of medical marijuana.
Right. Not even medical.
Right. Just medical or just marijuana.
Right.
You get so used to.
Yeah. Forgive me.
You know.
Forgive me. I didn't interrupt you.
No, that's fine. Now, granted, it's still a felony crime, but there's no federal agents, arguably, that are still obviously pursuing. I'm just trying to say that, I mean, we aren't technically a Unitarian.
No, God, no.
Right, exactly. Right.
Okay, I'm sorry, which is my point. So what we're saying is we're neither fish nor fowl. There's three different systems.
Right.
That's, okay, so it's confederal, federal, and unitary. And so what I'm saying, right, by virtue of limiting what we are not, is saying that this is what we are. We're straight in the middle.
Right.
Exactly my point, right?
Okay.
Now, but you talk about, marijuana, you can talk about euthanasia, you can talk about other
Yeah.
federal laws that are being circumvented by the states.
I don't know how that would be a good. I don't know why they would think it would be a good idea, because I feel like you're just reverting back to a monarchy, patriarchy, whatever you want to call it,
Yes.
kind of state by
Well,
saying.
and it's up to the courts to interpret what the Constitution means. And so the Constitution evolves. It is set in stone. It is ratified. It is set in stone. But the Supreme Court is what Wilson called a constitutional convention in continuous session. They're rewriting the Constitution every time they interpret what the Constitution means. So what that is today is very different from what it was 10 years ago, 20 years, 50 years ago. So the idea is that the court keeps the Constitution breathing. So cases arise, marijuana, abortion, euthanasia. These cases arise, and the courts have to look at the intent of the founding generation right, all of the Federalist Papers, to determine, is this what they meant? Or is the federal power overreaching? Last week we had an example of the Gun-Free Zone Act, Lopez, and we argued that the federal government based it on the Commerce Clause, right? And the Supreme Court struck it down and said that's outside the purview of the federal government. The federal government overstepped its power. So the system works. It checks the balances of both the federal and the state in time. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, we also examined a couple of weeks ago when we were looking at the social contract. He was one of the philosophers we studied for his impact directly on the Declaration of Independence. Now, Rousseau, again, writing in A Lasting Peace Through the Federation of Europe and the State of War, which was translated in 1917, he presented several conditions for a successful federal system, including that all major geographic powers must be members, that joint legislation must be binding, that joint forces must be stronger than any single state, and that secession must be illegal. He argued that unanimity was required for any changes to the agreement. So unanimity was required under the Articles of Confederation, which is one of the reasons it didn't work. Unanimity means that everybody agrees. All the states agree. In order to change something or to affect something, all the states had to agree. If less than all the states agreed, then it was simply a resolution in support of. It wasn't able to, in fact, to change to the law, which was one of the problems. Immanuel Kant, our last philosopher, defended Confederation in his work on perpetual peace in 1795. So this postdates the Constitution, but it's still worth mentioning. He holds that the right of nations shall be based on a pacific or a peaceful federation among free states rather than a peace treaty. So he's differentiating between a federation, which is what we have, and a peace treaty, which is something akin to the Articles of Confederation, where you had independent states coming together in a peace treaty, and how that's differentiated them from a federation, pure and simple. He says, this federation does not aim to acquire any power like that of a state, but merely to preserve and secure the freedom of each state in itself. Okay, so this is the philosophic background to federalism, right? This notion of federalism. So what was our founding generation thinking? Well, I have three examples for you. Washington's farewell address, and then Federalist number 10 and Federalist number 46. So you guys with me? Washington. We remember George Washington as the great statesman. We remember from our lecture on the Constitution that they saw Washington and were able to see him in the executive office, but not beyond Washington. It was the person of Washington that allowed the compromise of the second article in the Constitution to be framed, yes? We agreed. It was about Washington's person. Now, that being said, we have this great statesman, we have this father of his country giving his last speech, Washington's farewell address, right? So it has the power, it has the authority, it has the influence that you would expect it would. So what does he choose to spend a lot of his time on? Federalism. The unity of government which constitutes you one people is also now dear to you. It is justly so, for it is the main pillar in the edifice of your real independence, the support of your tranquility at home, your peace abroad, of your safety, of your prosperity, of the very liberty that you so highly prize. But as it is easy to foresee that from different causes and from different quarters much pains will be taken, many artifices employed to weaken in your minds the conviction of this truth, as this is the point in your political fortress against which the batteries of internal and external enemies will be most constantly and actively, though often covertly and insidiously directed, it is of infinite moment that you should properly estimate the immense value of your national union to your collective and individual happiness. That you should cherish a cordial, habitual, and immovable attachment to it, accustoming yourselves to think and speak of it as the palladium of your political safety and prosperity, watching for its preservation with jealous anxiety, discounting whatever may suggest even a suspicion that it can be in any event abandoned, and indignantly frowning upon the first dawning of every attempt to alienate any portion of our country from the rest, or to enfeeble the sacred ties which now link the various parts. For this you have every inducement of sympathy and interest. Citizens, by birth or choice of a common country, that country has a right to concentrate your affections. The name of American, which belongs to you in your national capacity, must always exalt the just pride of patriotism more than any appellation derived from local discriminations. With slight shades of difference, you have the same religion, manners, habits, political principles. You have in common cause fought and triumphed together. The independence and liberty you possess are the work of joint councils, and joint councils of common dangers, sufferings, and success. But these considerations, however powerfully they address themselves to your sensibility, are greatly outweighed by those which apply more immediately to your interest. Here, every portion of our country finds the most commanding motives for carefully guarding and preserving the Union as a whole. So what is he talking about? Where is he coming from? The Articles of Confederation were state-based. You were a Virginian. You were a New Yorker. You were a Pennsylvanian, right? You belonged to the state. The state was your identification. Washington was a Virginian. Now he's saying that we set aside the appellation derived from local discriminations. You're a Virginian second. You're an American first. So he's really hammering home the value of this federal system. And again, this is his farewell address of 1796. Next, I give you Federalist 10. So remember, last week we talked about the Federalist Papers and how important they are and what use they were during the ratification process. Madison is deathly afraid of faction. It's his great monster. It's his great political monster. Faction is defined, well, I'll let you know. He says, by faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. So a group among the larger group who have a distinct set of ideas about X, Y, or Z, a faction, a subset. Right? So we talked about factions in this class, and you probably have factions of Red Sox fans, right? And factions of Yankees fans, right? And so you know that the Yankees got swept this past weekend, so you know that the Red Sox, right, were victorious. So you have a faction. I just had to get that in there. The faction, right, is a subset of the whole. This is what Madison is so afraid of. I'm being blithe when I talk about baseball. Think about it in government. Think about it in the halls of Congress. And the sense of faction, the sense of separateness. What if it's a regional faction? The southern states versus the northern states, the large states versus the smaller states, the slave-owning states versus, you can see where we're going. This idea of faction is very worrisome. I continue. Again, this is Federalist 10. There are two methods of curing the mischiefs of faction. The one by removing its cause, the other by controlling its effects. There are, again, two methods of removing the causes of faction. The one, by destroying the liberty which is essential to its existence. The other, by giving to every citizen the same opinions, the same passions, and the same interests. Yeah. Good luck with that. It could never be more truly said of the first remedy, destroying the liberty, than it was worse than the disease. Liberty is to faction what air is to fire, an ailment without which it instantly expires. But it could not be less folly to abolish liberty, which is essential to political life because it nourishes faction, than it would be to wish the annihilation of air, which is essential to animal life because it imparts to fire its destructive agency. The second expedient is as impracticable as the first would be unwise. As long as the reason of man continues fallible, and he is at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. It's part of human nature. We're going to have different opinions, right? But as long as the connection subsists between his reason and his self-love, his opinions and passions will always have a reciprocal influence on each other. And the former, his reason, will be the objects to which the latter, his self-love, will attach themselves. The diversity in the faculties of men, from which the property rights originate, is not less an insuperable obstacle to the uniformity of interests. The protection of these faculties, the protection of property, we talked about Locke, and the rights of property evidenced in Locke's philosophy, is the first order of government. It's the first object of government to protect property rights. Again, individualism, contracts and law, property rights, these sound familiar? The core tenets of classic liberalism. From the protection of different and unequal faculties of acquiring property, the possession of different degrees and kinds of property immediately results, and from the influence on these sentiments and views of the respective proprietors ensures a division of society into different interests and parties. Just by virtue of being individuals and having contracts and law and the right to own property, that in and of itself is going to cause faction. Even if mankind weren't stubborn and opinionated and often misinformed, as if we weren't dumb enough, the right to property is going to ensure that that's going to happen anyway. The other point of difference is the number of citizens and extent of territory which may be brought within the compass of Republican rather than democratic government, and it is this circumstance principally which renders factious combinations less to be dreaded in the former than in the latter, less to be dread in the republic than in the democracy. The smaller the society, the fewer probably will be the distinct parties and interests composing it. Montesquieu, right? The fewer the distinct parties and interests, the more frequently will the majority be found of the same party. And the smaller the number of individuals composing a majority, and the smaller the compass within which they are placed, the more easily will they concert and execute their plans of oppression. Extend the sphere, and you take in a great variety of parties and interests. This is Hume. You make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have the common motive to invade the rights of other citizens. Or, if common motive exists, it will be more difficult for those who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison with each other. Besides other impediments, other roadblocks, it may be remarked that where there is consciousness of unjust or dishonorable purposes, communication is always checked by distrust in proportion to the numbers whose concurrence is necessary. The more people in the conversation, pluralism, the more likely you'll have protection of liberty against the tyranny of the majority. Federalist 10, arguing for federalism, citing Montesquieu, Hume, and Locke. Finally, I give you Federalist number 46. Now, this is, again, 1788. I know it's a lot of reading. Take a deep breath, right? There's a lot of background, but we have to get this under our belts in order to understand what federalism is. The influence of state and federal governments compared. Federalist 46, 1788. Many considerations based on those suggested on former occasion seem to place it beyond doubt that the first and natural attachment of the people will be to the governments of their respective states. I am a Virginian, I am a Pennsylvanian, I am a New Yorker. Into the administration of these, a greater number of individuals will expect to rise. With the affairs of these, the people will be more familiar and minutely conversant. People are more familiar with the government at the local level, the government at the state level, than they will be with the government at the national level, which is 3,000 miles away. And with the members of these, a greater proportion of people will have ties of personal acquaintance and friendship at the local level, at the state level, and of family and party attachments. On the side of these, therefore, the popular bias may well be expected most strongly to incline. But ambitious encroachments of the federal government on the authority of state governments would not excite the opposition of a single state or of a few states only. They would be signals of general alarm. Every government would espouse the common cause. A correspondence would be open. Plans of resistance would be concerted. One spirit would animate and conduct the whole. So while we're aware that the attachment will be of the individual to the state, the imposition, the creation of a strong national government will eventually lure them to an affection for the national government But that's not to say that the national government will always hold the day. The state governments, by virtue of their continued existence in the constitutional system, which is why I make great pains to talk about the Madisonian model, including the states, because they are part of the balance of power. Madison says so in Federalist 46. Remember, the Federalist Papers were written after the Constitutional Convention. Madison didn't come to that understanding, the role of the states, until the Great Compromise, when he saw the light. During the Constitutional Convention, he was humble enough to say, you know what, I hadn't thought of that, but gosh darn it, it's a good idea, it works. And here he is espousing it as one of the key elements of constitutional federalism. So, federalism in the United States embraces the following elements. As in all federations, the union of the several autonomous political entities, or the states, for common purposes, the division of legislative powers between a national government on the one hand and constituent states on the other, which division is governed by the rule that the former is a government of enumerated powers, while the latter are governments of residual powers. Remember the 9th and 10th Amendments. The direct operation, for the most part, of each of these centers of government within its assigned sphere upon all persons and property within its territorial limits. The provision of each center with the complete apparatus of law enforcement, both executive and judicial. The supremacy of the national government within its assigned sphere over any conflicting assertion of state power, and, as I mentioned, dual citizenship. The third and the fourth of the above-listed salient features of the American federal system are the ones with which, at the outset, marked it off most sharply from all preceding systems that we've talked about in this class, in which the member states generally agreed to obey the mandates of a common government for certain stipulated purposes, but retained to themselves the right of ordaining and enforcing the laws of the Union. This, indeed, was the system provided in the Articles of Confederation. The Convention of 1787 was well aware, of course, that if the inanities and futilities of the Confederation were to be avoided in the new system, the latter must incorporate more of a coercive principle. And Mr. Ellsworth of Connecticut expressed it. The only question was whether it should be a coercion of law or a coercion of arms, whether that coercion which acts only upon delinquent individuals or that which is applicable to sovereign body states in their political capacity. The former principle was established, albeit without entirely discarding the latter, or the war between the states would not have happened. The sheer fact of federalism enters the purview of constitutional law. That is, it becomes a judicial concept. In the consequence of the conflicts which have at times arisen between the idea of state autonomy or state sovereignty and the principle of national supremacy. Exaltation in national supremacy, as it was recognized in the Supremacy Clause that we talked about last week in Article 4, Paragraph 2 of the Constitution, was the very keystone that Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall constituted jurisprudence. It was Marshall's position that the Supremacy Clause was intended to be applied literally. Remember the first night we talked about structural and procedural balance of power, right? I said that the Madisonian model sets up the structure in the Constitution. The structure is the legislature, the executive, the courts, the states, that's the structure. The process, the procedure by which the structure works, right? How a bill becomes a law, the ability of the president to veto a law, two-thirds majority overriding a veto. All these are processes, right? The structure are the institutions. The process is how the institutions work. Check. The Constitution then sets up structural as well as procedural balance of power by its deliberate choice of a federal system. The federal system is part of the Madisonian model's structure and process. So, here's how. We go back to Federalist theory, and the idea of a theory helping us define who we are by looking at who we are not. All right? Check. And so we have three species, three categories of federalism to examine. They include a unitary system, a confederal system, and a federal system. We'll go through these individually. A unitary federalism has a very strong central government and weak dependent member states. Our best example of a unitary system that's in current existence today is France. Sir?
What about Russia?
Russia is actually going to be a confederation.
Oh,
and I'll show you that. Great question. It's called the Commonwealth of Independent States. So we have in France, then here's a map of France, right? Anybody been? Anybody traveled? Huh? Layover. You've been? Okay. If you ever go, you'll realize that as you go from region to region, some of these regions, now they look like states, right? They have names and they have borders, they have identifications, but they're much different from states as we understand them in the United States, right? These regions have existed not just like California for 150 years or even, Massachusetts or New York or Virginia for 230 years. These regions go back millennia. These regions were extant before the Romans. And so we're talking about regions with incredible history, with language, religion, culture, art, cuisine, very distinct regions. Heck, many of these pre-existed France long time, whereas some of them once belonged to the Holy Roman Empire, some of them belonged to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, some of them belonged to Spain, some of them belonged to Italy. You get the idea, right? Germany, right, well, right, exactly, especially, right, World War II. So you have these regions then. Now, the problem is, remember the French Revolution? Liberty, equality, and fraternity, the great cry of the French Revolution? How are you going to instill, how are you going to guarantee liberty, equality, and fraternity with a set of regions that are so strong in their self-identification, other than a very strong central system of government imposing egalitarianism, fraternity on these regions? That's done through a strong central system. Have you ever heard the term herding cats? Okay, so this is like herding cats. How do you get these regions to behave? Iron will. You put them under your thumb, a unitary system of government. So, since the French Revolution, nearly all French regimes have suppressed regional and ethnic differences in the name of equality and in the name of uniformity through a highly centralized state. So being a unitary expression, the central government has full unquestioned power to create new regions or departments, merge several into one, or abolish existing regions. The central can also alter the region's boundaries. So let's bring this into our contemporary understanding. Imagine Washington saying, California no longer exists. California is now a part of Nevada. That type of power, that strong central authority, is an exemplification of a strong unitary state. That's what a unitary state would do. Another aspect would be the borders of these regions are overlaid by administrative districts that are children of the central, and these administrative districts are headed by a prefect or an official who's answerable to the prime minister, who's answerable to the central government. And so you take the same map, right, and you impose over it national administrative regions. So let's pick on Strasbourg, right? And so Paris, the strong central government, overlays an administrative district over Strasbourg. Now, Strasbourg can still make laws within the purview of their constitutional authority, but all these laws have to be approved by the prefect of the administrative district that's overlain. In other words, Paris has to approve the local laws. Imagine then California. Now, this happens when you challenge a law and the constitutionality of a law. Surely the federal courts can go over it. But what you're looking at then is all laws being made accountable to the central government. This is a strong central authority. You're following, right?
Yep.
And so another good example of an extant unitary system of government is the Catholic Church. Now, before you throw a brick at me, I know that the Catholic Church is a religion, but it's also a government. And here's how. In the Catholic Encyclopedia, it says, in the hierarchy of jurisdiction, the episcopate, which is the collection of the bishops, and the papacy, the pope, are of divine origin. So this goes back to legitimacy of authority, right? It goes back to the divine right of kings. They're citing divine origin as giving the hierarchy of the episcopacy and the papacy legitimacy. The Bishop of Rome, the Pope, as successor to St. Peter, has been established by Christ as the visible head of the whole church and possesses real primacy, real control, real first buck stops here authority of jurisdiction over the universal church in matters of faith, morals, discipline. Sure, that's what you would expect in a church, but also the government of the church. And so the Pope has real primacy. This is an autocracy. This is a monarchy. The government of the church, by divine origin, is a unitary system where you have weak dependent member states, which are the dioceses or the archdiocese, headed by the bishops, the princes of the church. But the Pope, the monarch, controls in a very unitary system. The other side of the coin is a confederation. We're much more used to the idea of a confederation, having studied the Articles of Confederation last week, right? And it's an association of sovereign states or communities, usually created by treaty, coming together in a loose treaty, but later often adopting a stronger common constitution. An historic example is the confederal system under the Articles of Confederation. But what about contemporary examples? I have two. First would be what was the former Soviet Union, and the day it disestablished, the day it disappeared, stepped to the plate the Commonwealth of Independent States. The Commonwealth of Independent States is a loose treaty of now independent sovereign states, those former Soviet satellite nations, coming together to continue in a loose confederation, trade, finance, lawmaking, and security. But as the independence of these nations rose, as they found their footing as independent nations, the value of the CIS lessened. And to give you a feel for who these independent sovereign nations are, it includes Russia, Moldova, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Armenia, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, the Ukraine, Georgia, Turkmenistan, Latvia, and Lithuania. They were loath to give up, the sovereign states, were loath to give up any of their independence, any of their sovereignty. And so the best thing in recent years the CIS has been able to achieve is to help the former Soviet satellites mount Olympic teams. You're looking at the former Soviet Union. You have Kazakhstan, the Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan. These are all former Soviet satellites who are members of the Commonwealth of Independent States. So let me ask you, who in here has heard of the Commonwealth of Independent States prior to tonight? One person. My point. It's a very loose confederation. It's very weak. It's almost non-existent. Now here's another one that you may have heard of.
Can you call it the predecessor to the EU?
No. The predecessor to the EU is the Maastricht Treaty, right? Coming out of World War II, that was...
Oh, what do you know? They're European.
Here we are, the European Union. Well, see, great minds think alike. So the European Union, then, is a perfect example of a confederation because it began with the Maastricht Treaty, which is a treaty of independent nations coming together in this effort. The idea was to stop war. That if you can get one nation to invest in the infrastructure and to have economic ties with another nation, the stronger those ties, the stronger that investment, the more money you have flowing, the more citizens you have flowing back and forth, the less likely in the future will be the potential for war. And so you come together in a loose confederation, And as time evolves from World War II on, the European Union has strengthened and strengthened. Now, this is a whole class unto itself. But the idea that there's been a number of constitutions in the European Union where the central government has become stronger and stronger and stronger. To the point last year where you may know, if you're interested in finances, Greece, Italy, Spain found themselves in dire economic straits by virtue of the global meltdown, right?
Bad.
And it's still bad, right? And so the European Union, Germany being its financial leader, imposed very severe financial restrictions on Greece in order to allow them loans so that they wouldn't go into default, that they wouldn't go into bankruptcy. And so the central government is able to tell Greece how to run its internal affairs. This is how strong the European Union has become, right? So you begin with a loose confederation, and it evolves from a loose treaty into a stronger federation, just like it's supposed to, right? Just like our theory says that it does. Excellent. All right. Sir?
But it's really branching out. I mean, it's really making, for instance, like Greece, that didn't want to be a part of the EU, and obviously there's their exchange rate. There is no exchange rate for their currency as well. So obviously inflation is a huge political turmoil, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But they wanted to maintain their independence,
right?
And because they didn't, their country is worse than Iran,
right?
And now they are forced, literally, to be a part of the European
right.
Union, and
because they can't afford not to,
right? And
yes.
now, I mean, that's really kind of like, in lack of better terms, just like a really asshole move from the European Union to do that. And now.
It's true. It's true. But if you look at it dispassionately, Gatsby, for a minute, I get you. There was a reason why in the ratification of the Constitution they only required 9 of the 13 states to ratify, because all strong geographic powers need to be a member of the Union. This is just straight political science. Because if you have this juggernaut of the EU and then little Greece, right, they'll just be rudderless. They'll be gobbled up, right? And so it's better to join.
They're really forcing their hand, though.
Oh, absolutely. I'm not saying that they're not. But then, too, weren't the 9 states who ratified the Constitution forcing the hands of Virginia and Massachusetts, who hadn't yet ratified?
Yes.
Well, right? It's the same mechanism. You make a good point. I'm not arguing with you. But the idea is that if you have this juggernaut of a confederation, right, like the United States Constitution, where you have 9 states coming together and 4 states still without, it's either join or die. Right? Excellent point, though. So this is just a very quick from the Stafford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So they're examining for us, and I like to paraphrase them, but I certainly like to give them credit, because this is a very well laid out argument for a federal order rather than confederal or unitary. So here's a list of reasons for a federal order rather than unitary or confederal. Federations may foster peace in the sense of preventing wars and preventing fears of war in several ways. So states can join a federation to become jointly powerful enough to dissuade external aggressors and or to prevent aggression and preemptive wars among themselves. Federations can promote economic prosperity by removing internal barriers to trade through economies of scale, by establishing and maintaining inter-member unit trade agreements, or by becoming a sufficiently large global player to affect international trade regimes. Federal arrangements may protect individuals against political authorities by constraining state sovereignty, placing some powers in the center, right? This division of powers in the Madisonian model. By entrusting the center with the authority to intervene in member units, the federal arrangements can protect minorities' human rights against the member unit's authorities. So if California were to try to hurt a minority group within its borders, it would be beholden on the central government, Washington, to step in and to stop the local government, the state government, from hurting minorities. Does that make sense? Federal arrangements may enhance political influence of formerly sovereign governments. So the collective of the EU, when the EU speaks, it's speaking by virtue of the collection of all the governments that belong to it. So the whole lake rises. The sum total of power is greater when the EU speaks than the individual sovereign governments. And this facilitates coordination, particularly for the smaller states, by giving those member units influence or even veto in policy making rather than merely taking policy decisions from the center. The Federation may promote cooperation, justice, or other values among and within member units, as well as among and within their constituent units, for instance, by monitoring, legislating, enforcing, or funding agreements, human rights efforts, immunity from interference, or human development. So here are the reasons to prefer federal over a unitary state, like France. Federal arrangements may protect central authorities by securing immunity and non-domination for minority groups or nations. Constitutional allocation of powers to the member political units protects individuals from the center, while interlocking governments provide influence on central decisions via the member units' bodies. So just as the central government can step in and stop the state government in a confederal model, talking against a unitary model, the state governments can also tell the central government, knock it off. The conversation works both ways. In a central government, you lose the authority of the states to tell the central what to do. In a confederal, you lose the authority of the central to tell the states what to do. With a pure federal model in the middle, you have conversation going both ways. Does that make sense? More specifically, federal arrangements can accommodate minority nations who aspire to self-determination and preservation of their culture, language, or religion. Federal orders may increase the opportunities for citizen participation in public decision-making through deliberation in offices in both member unit and central bodies that enhances character formation through political participation among the broader citizenship. Finally, federal arrangements may not only protect existing clusters of individuals with shared values and preferences, but it actually promotes mobility and hence territorial clustering of individuals with similar preferences. Member unit autonomy to experiment may foster competition for individuals who are free to move where their preferences are best met. So if you want to smoke pot, move to Colorado. That's what they're saying, right? And so these individual states can best promote from within their state, and it will attract. And people can actually move, and it promotes that mobility for people to move where they want to live, where the political culture speaks to you, right? As an individual, for heaven's sakes, move there.
So controversy has long raged over the issue of what federalism does to the functioning of a political system. Regrettably, little systematic analysis has been presented to enable us to judge the competing claims, and some people even disagree over whether some of the benefits are really benefits. This issue is clearly one in need of further research in political science. But to put a capstone on it before we move on to the next part of our lecture today, I would argue that the benefits of federalism include, well, flexibility. One of the commonly cited advantages of federalism is the ability to permit variations in policies to correspond to variations in local desires and problems, as we just stated with the recreational marijuana laws. In a purely unitary system, one national policy then would be established for all, leaving little flexibility to adapt to regional differences. With federalism, different states can tailor their respective policies to match state opinion. This benefit will only be produced if state policies actually respond to public desires, and there is some evidence that they do. If, however, a state lacks the resources to support a program the public wants, or if state officials ignore or worse, misinterpret public demands, the result may not be adaptation to what the citizens want. Secondly, obviously, is preventing abuse of power. A second advantage of federalism is its ability to prevent the abuse of governmental power. Two mechanisms help to produce this effect. First, a federal system, in contrast to a collection of small independent nations, includes a large and diverse population with many different beliefs and interests. As a result, no single group is likely to be able to gain control of the government and ride roughshod over the rights of others. A system of countervailing power, then, in which each group is held in check by the opposition of the other groups, is created, which is exactly what James Madison predicted in Federalist 61, where again he said the influence of factious leaders may kindle a flame within their particular states, but will be unable to spread a general conflagration through other states. A religious sect may degenerate into a political faction in part of the Confederacy, but the variety of sects dispersed over the entire face of it must secure the national councils against any danger from that source. A group might be strong enough to achieve a position of dominance in a single community or even a single state, but the diversity of interests at the national level serves to limit the power of any single group. Federalism also helps to prevent abuse of power through the mechanism of redundancy. If a political system has only one government, and that government malfunctions in the sense of perhaps becoming tyrannical, the citizens could be extremely vulnerable, you would imagine. The federal system, with its many governments, will be less affected by one malfunction. Other governments can step in and correct the situation. Note that dual federalism, with its emphasis on separation of natural and state governments, provides little opportunity for one level to intervene if the other level fails to protect citizens' rights. It is probably not coincidental that when dual federalism was the dominant model of federalism employed by the Supreme Court, as we're going to talk about here in a little bit, the national government conspicuously failed to protect the rights of black Americans who were being abused by state and local governments. Interdependent models of federalism, with their acceptance of interactions among all levels of government, undoubtedly make the redundancy mechanism more effective in preventing abuse of power by recognizing the propriety of one level trying to influence the others. Furthermore, this federalism encourages innovation. So we know that federalism has been praised for its ability to stimulate innovation. With more than 82,000 subnational governments in the United States, we have many arenas in which new policies can be tested. As a result, we can try many different policies at once and learn about their effects more quickly than we would by trying one new policy at a time nationwide. Many national government programs were initially adopted at the state or local level. For example, the modern income tax was actually developed in Wisconsin and then spread to other state governments and was finally adopted by the national government. If a policy fails to perform as expected or has undesirable side effects, it will do less damage testing it in a few localities rather than testing it nationally. Furthermore, federalism provides for competition through responsiveness and efficiency. So it could be argued to some observers that federalism stimulates a healthy competition among government and fosters responsiveness and efficiency, right? So a single government enjoys a monopoly on public services that may lead to waste, perhaps, and unresponsiveness. With a multiplicity of governments, citizens in different jurisdictions can compare the services they receive and the costs they pay. Those who are receiving less and paying more will bring pressure for reform on their officials. Failing reform, as a last resort, they may relocate to another jurisdiction. Officials have added incentive to meet public demands. With cooperative federalism, as we'll talk about, competition within levels is complemented by competition among levels. People who are not satisfied with the performance of one level of government can turn to another level. The growth of government responsibilities and functions has brought with it another benefit of federalism: management. In a large and complex society such as we have, the task of operating all governmental activities is too large for any single unit to manage. By parceling out the burden of administration over many governmental units, federalism prevents any one from being overwhelmed by the hugeness of the task. Finally, federalism helps by coping with conflict. Federalism has been praised for its ability to help political systems cope with conflict. Part of this ability results from allowing different states or localities to have different policies, with the result that they do not have to engage in political combat with one another, assuming that they are willing to tolerate the variations in policy. Federalism also aids in the management of conflict by creating many centers for resolving conflict. In a purely unitary system, all political tension is focused on the single central government. It must bear all the anger, resentment, and frustration brought to bear on the political system. A federal system disperses those tensions over many jurisdictions, thus helping to keep them at a more manageable level. So to conclude, before we move on to the next part of our lecture, federalism is a system of government that includes a national government and at least one level of subnational governments. In addition, each level is able to make some decisions independently of the other. Each level may be equally powerful or may be more powerful, or one may be more powerful than the other. Some observers regard federalism as a competitive enterprise, with the different levels contending for power. Well, in this view, one level can gain importance only by reducing the importance of the other. Other observers emphasize the interdependence of federalism, with powers and responsibilities being shared by national and subnational governments. This perspective contends that much activity in a federal system involves various governments working toward common goals. Finally, functional models of federalism place primary emphasis on divisions among functional specialists, such as educators, social workers, transportation officials, rather than divisions between levels of government. Advocates of federalism contend that it produces many social benefits, including responsiveness to varying needs and opinions, as I suggest, the reduced risk of abuse of power, greater innovation, and increased military strength. Critics of federalism charge, however, that federalism encourages neglect of spillover effects, inaction, hyperlocalism, and inequality in services and, well, basic rights. The relative importance of these various effects is, to some degree, a matter of personal values. Having summed up that, we now turn our attention to the 6 key characteristics of a federal model.
The 6 key characteristics that define a federal model. And so if you're looking at what a federal model is when it's not a unitary or when it's not confederal, these 6 key characteristics are always in a federal model. They may not always be in a unitary or a confederal model. So here's how. The rule of law, and we'll go through these individually, law enforcement, applicability, independent legislative institutions, democracy, and constitutionally defined responsibilities. Okay, so here we go. The rule of law. Anarchic relationships, or an absence of law, right? Anarchy is the absence of law, the absence of government. Anarchic relations between the member states, as in the Articles of Confederation. Remember we were talking about the skirmishes and the trade wars between the independent states. Anarchic relationships between the member states are replaced by the rule of law, which is guaranteed by common institutions. The common institutions in our constitutional system are Congress, the presidency, and the courts. Those are the common institutions to us. So whether you're a Californian or a Floridian or an Arkansanian, right, these common institutions, they are all our Congress. They are all our president, regardless of what state you're in. The law of the Union, therefore, this Constitution, is superior to the law of its member states in the fields defined by the Constitution. You have to have the supremacy of law in order to have the rule of law. If another state can make a law that supersedes the Constitution, then you no longer have the rule of law. The rule of law is based in a constitutional republic in the Constitution. So the Constitution has to be supreme. Okay. Law and the existence of law is all well and good, but if you don't have law enforcement, you have nothing, right? You have to enforce this puppy. So to ensure the rule of law, these common institutions, particularly the president and the courts, have independent law enforcement powers and responsibilities. So the president is invested in Article 2 of the Constitution with executive powers, the power to execute, to execute the laws, to enforce the laws. That's what it means, to execute the law, to put it into motion. To implement the law is to execute it. Law enforcement. I'm not talking about badges and guns. I'm talking about enforcing the law at the national level by common institutions, the presidency and then the courts. The courts enforce the law by virtue of holding your feet to the fire. So if you break the law, we throw you in jail or we fine you, right? That there's penalties for breaking the law, so we enforce the law. Next, applicability. So again, the law of the Union, the supreme law, is applicable to all the member states. Now, this isn't going to be true in a confederal system. Paris can very well have a law that's going to affect Rouen and not affect Lyon, right? You can have a law in a unitary system that is applied to one region or one state. In a true federal model, the law of the Union, the law coming out of the legislature and being implemented by the president, has to be applicable to all the member states. You can't pick on a state. And to its citizens living within its borders. So this is where full faith and credit comes in. When we talked about Article 4 of the Constitution, and full faith and credit. So whether you're a citizen of California, Arkansas, or Alaska, if you move from one state to another, you're still guaranteed the rights listed at the national level, right? You're still an American citizen. You still have those rights, regardless of whether you're living in this state or that state. So applicability to the states, but more crucially to the individuals living within the borders. In order to have the rule of law, you have to have independent legislatures. You have to have the ability to make the law independent of others. If you're a unitary system, you can make law, but then Paris oversees it, right? And so you don't have a pure federal model. Each member state has to have its own independent legislative process, which is distinct from the other member states. The laws don't require, in California when we make a law, it doesn't require ratification by the other states or by the central government. It's within the purview of our constitutional responsibilities that we talked about last week. Those powers reserved to the states, right? The 10th Amendment. Then you have the independent legislatures making law within their purview, within their rights. So it begs the question, legitimate authority, if we don't have the divine right of kings, if you have an independent legislature, where is that legitimacy coming from? Where does their independence come from? The people. And so democracy is the common institutions as well as those of the member states are democratic in nature. So we have a republic. We go by the rule of law, but there are elements of democracy in our republic. They are democratic by nature. And this is evidenced, as I'm going to show, through elections, right? Through the franchise, that we, the people, participate both at the national and at the local level. The final key element are constitutionally defined responsibilities. So the common institutions, Congress, the presidency, the courts, are asked to implement common policies where problems are shared in order that these problems may be jointly addressed, but no more. They're limited by their scope in the Constitution. How the Constitution creates these 6 key elements to a pure federal model that's neither unitary nor confederal, you saw this coming, right? We have the rule of law that is held in the Supremacy Clause, which is Article 4. And also, I might add, in the provision for impeachment, which is both in Articles 1 and 2. This shows that the rule of law, the supremacy of law, doesn't just relate to other laws, but it also relates to people, to individuals, that no one person is above the law. This is where impeachment comes in, right? Law enforcement is found in the executive powers of the president to enforce the laws, which is in Article 2, and establishing the independent judiciary who has the power to create penalties for breaking the law. Applicability is found, as I suggested, in Article 4, Section 1, full faith and credit, and in relations among the states, Article 4 generally. Independent legislatures are found in the admissions of the states, Article 4, Section 3. That guarantees independent legislatures in the independent states and also guaranteeing a republican form of government, the rule of law, in Article 4, Section 4. You can't swing a cat in the Constitution without hitting democracy. I mean, it's all over the place. Whether you're talking about elections, terms, or franchise, the right to vote, you're looking in Articles 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So democracy is shot through. This element of we the people is shot through. Finally, constitutionally defined responsibilities are in Article 1, Sections 8 and 10, and in the 9th and 10th Amendments. Now, the Madisonian model furthers this division of authority in a federal model by allowing for the evolution of 7 different types of power. Now, this is going to blow your mind. We said that power is the ability to get somebody to do what you want them to do. Whether you ask nicely, whether you twist their arm, whether you pay them off, whether you lie to them and cheat them, power is getting somebody to do what you want them to do. That's a pretty basic definition. We can be much more subtle. We can be much more sophisticated in our definitions, right? And so I would argue that the 7 different powers in their relation to federalism in the Constitution are these. They're expressed, implied, resulting, inherent, concurrent, reserved, and prohibited. All right. We're going to go through these individually, obviously. I wouldn't give you a list like that. Expressed or enumerated powers. Article 1, Section 8. Remember last week when we were going through the Constitution, I spent so much time going over the enumerated powers. These are the ideas that are expressly listed as powers given to one of the branches, the legislative branch. Even the executive branch has expressed or enumerated powers. For example, Article 1, Section 8 says that Congress has the power to declare war, to punish piracies, to coin money, among many, several, right? So these are the expressed or the enumerated powers. From the expressed or the enumerated powers rise the implied powers. And so, according to the necessary and proper clause, the loophole through which I said we can drive an aircraft carrier last week, remember? Congress generally may assume additional powers not enumerated in the Constitution if there is a link to that power that is listed in the Constitution. Here's how. Can the U.S. government create a national bank? Well, that's a damn good question. Hamilton came up with the idea, our first Secretary of the Treasury, and the Jeffersonian Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, hated the idea. Said that's nowhere in the Constitution, you can't do that, it's unconstitutional, no, no way, no way, no way. The Supreme Court found in McCulloch versus Maryland that indeed the Congress did have the power to create a national bank, even though creating a national bank wasn't an enumerated power, because that power was implied. Here's how. You're asking the Congress in its enumerated powers to raise and support an army and a navy, to build post offices and post roads, to raise money, to impose taxes. You have this great swath of enumerated power. What are you going to do it out of a desk? You need an institution. You need a bank to do this, right? You have to have some kind of a financial institution to conduct all this business in. So, the necessary and proper clause says whatever is necessary and proper to effect any of the foregoing powers is A-OK. The Supreme Court said that building a national bank is part of that. It's an implied power. Who knew? The same Chief Justice, John Marshall, also introduced the concept of resulting powers. These, which would rather be a result from the whole mass of the powers of the national government and from the nature of political society than a consequence or incidence of the powers enumerated. So, bear with me. The Constitution confers absolutely on the government of the Union, the central government, the power of making war and making treaties. So these are enumerated powers. You can say the government then possesses the power of acquiring territory either by conquest or by treaty. From the power to acquire territory arises the inevitable consequence to govern it. So you have the express power of making war, making treaties. An implied power, because the effect of making war or making treaties is often to gain territory. The Louisiana Purchase, Thomas Jefferson, nowhere did it say he can increase the size of the United States. What he did was a treaty where he bought territory. He knew that that was kind of on shaky ground constitutionally. He said as much. The same guy who argued against the National Bank. I'm not going to argue. But, so we have a resulting power. If you can get territory, isn't a result that you get to govern it? What, are you going to get territory and then just leave it be? It's a resulting power that you have the right to govern it. So an express power to make war, to make treaties, which is implied that you're going to get territory because that's what you do by making war and making treaties. Thirdly, the resulting power, you get to govern it. They're distinctions, but they're important distinctions because when you're talking about power, especially at the national level, it's not just how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. There are very important consequences to allowing one branch or the other too much power. And so this right of constitutional power is a very sophisticated measure, and you have to think it through logically. For example, where the heck did we get the power to make war? That's an inherent power. Inherent powers are those authorities that are necessary to the administration of the system itself. For example, it's an inherent power of a nation among nations to maintain diplomatic ties with foreign governments. That's what a nation does. The executive's power to receive ambassadors and the Congress's ability to make treaties are resulting powers that stem from the power inherent in being a nation among nations. And so in the Declaration of Independence, when we read it last week, you thought I was just being dramatic, right? But the Declaration of Independence, in its final paragraph, establishes inherent power. So we're saying that we are a nation now, a nation among nations. And that as free and independent states, they have the full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other things and acts which independent states may have right to do. And so nobody is giving us the power to make war, to make treaties. It is an inherent power of a nation. So you have to say that you're a nation, and as a nation then, you have that inherent power to make war. And what they're saying is, guess what, George? We have the power to make war. And we're going to make it, right? We're fighting for our independence, hence the Revolutionary War. I'm being dramatic, but if you think about it, where does this right of being a nation among nations come from? Why is it so important when we get to the presidency and the right of the president to receive ambassadors? You may think this is no big deal, right? For the president to receive an ambassador, the person walks up to the White House and you accept the person's credentials. But are you aware, perhaps, that when the president receives an ambassador, it's tantamount to acknowledging that ambassador's credentials? If you acknowledge that ambassador's credentials, you acknowledge that ambassador's government as being authentic and being legitimate. And if you authorize or if you acknowledge a government being legitimate, you acknowledge its right to declare war, conduct treaties, contract alliances, all of the things that states may have right to do. Fine. So inherent powers are very important. Now, I have to do a very quick aside, because this is a common error. This isn't inherent, as in you inherit your at mods China. This is inherent. It's within. It is within you. It is a part of you, of your nature, of yourself. So they're two very distinct. I often get that error in papers. Inherent, not inherit. Okay. Concurrent. Like I said, taxes. You're paying taxes to both the national and the state government. Therefore, there is dual sovereignty. You are a citizen of both the U.S. and of California. And so the power to tax and spend is a concurrent power. They can both hold it at the same time. Then reserve powers. Well, you have to have government. Reserve powers. The 10th Amendment was intended to confirm the understanding of the people at the time that the powers not granted to the United States were reserved to the states or to the people, respectively. It added nothing as originally in the Constitution, that the powers were reserved. So when you look at education, because education isn't given as an enumerated power to the federal government, it's a reserved power to the states. Prohibited. Article 6 of the Constitution makes it the supreme law of the land. So any state, or even Congress, may not create a law that is in conflict with the Constitution. Now, they do it, but it's by interpretation. Are they actively trying to make a law that is against the Constitution? If they are, that is prohibited. You can't make a law that is against the Constitution. This is how, if a law is found unconstitutional, it's the law that falls, not the Constitution. Secondly, Section 10 of Article 1 limit the powers to the states by prohibiting powers to the states. States may not make war among of themselves. California can't declare war, right? Nor can we coin money. Nor can we make treaties. That's a power inherent in the central government. And conversely, the central government is prohibited from granting titles of nobility, of making ex post facto laws. Ex post facto meaning after the fact. You can't make a law now that is going to be retroactively applied, right? And so these are prohibited powers. The evolution of federalism. What was described in the Constitution, what was created in the Constitution, is one model of federalism, but we have grown. We have 230 years of operation under our belt, so obviously things are going to evolve. How did they evolve? What were the elements of the evolution? We're going to see tonight the origination in dual federalism, going to cooperative federalism, going to creative federalism, and finally going to competitive or new federalism, or even new federalism that your book talks about, right? So this may sound familiar from chapter 3. This was all in there, but it's very confusing, this part, which is why I like to go over it. So we're going to start with marble cake versus layer cake. Fortunately, I'm not a big sugar guy, or that would be pretty crazy. Oh, is it red velvet?
Yeah.
Okay. Here's the thing. Dual federalism is exemplified by a layer cake. This lovely cake with, these 4 layers, very good, Mike, in a layer cake, divided by frosting. And so you have very distinct levels. And so this is representative of a level being the federal government, a level being the state government, a level being the cities and the counties. They're all separate. They have their constitutionally defined responsibilities, and they're separate. They never touch. They're separated by the Constitution, by the frosting. So there are elements of constitutional responsibilities given specifically to the national government: to declare war, to maintain the armed forces, to regulate interstate commerce, to admit new states. There are things that are given to the state specifically by virtue of not being given to the federal. Establishing and maintaining schools, establishing local governments, cities and counties, regulating business within the state, making marriage laws. These, because they're not given to the central government, are reserved to the states, the Ninth Amendment. And then there are those powers that are shared or concurrent: to maintain law and order, to levy taxes, to borrow money, to charter banks, to establish courts, and to provide for the public welfare. But in the New Deal legislation of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in the Depression, in an attempt to prime the economic pump, right? This is the Keynesian model of economics. You want to use the tax and spend power of the central government to prime the economic pump to get money flowing back in the system again. This is during the Great Depression in the 1930s. And so Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president, came to office with a slate of legislation, a number of pieces of legislation that was called the New Deal. The New Deal was to create a number of agencies at the federal level under the authority of the president that was meant to get money flowing again. Some examples are the Tennessee Valley Authority to electrify by building dams many parts of the South. The Civilian Conservation Corps, which was meant to get especially young men employed. And this was my father was part of this. And so if you look up and down California, Oregon, and Washington, especially on the coast, anybody been to the top of Mount Tam?
Yep.
You know that beautiful road that goes up there? That was the Civilian Conservation Corps.
Yeah.
They built that in the 1930s. It was a public works project that was part of the New Deal legislation. The New Deal meant to combine the efforts of the state, the federal, and the locals to help get the country out of the Depression. So we went from a model of federalism that's exemplified by the dual federalism, the layer cake, to more of a marble cake. It wasn't so delineated. It wasn't so clear, right, where the federal started and then where the state stopped. Here's another mnemonic. Rowboat federalism. This is FDR's explanation of the New Deal. He says, you have three guys in a boat, and one's rowing north, one's rowing south, and one has his oar up on the gunwale and is drinking a beer, not doing anything. What the heck? This is dual federalism. The feds are doing their thing, the states are doing their thing, the cities and counties are doing nothing, and we're just spinning around. We're doing nothing. Everybody needs to row in the same direction. This is rowboat federalism, going from dual federalism to cooperative federalism under the New Deal. So everybody cooperates. Everybody's getting to row in the same way, in the same direction, so that we can get somewhere. So there's no more this clear delineation between the feds and the states. There's a mix, like the Tennessee Valley Authority, where the federal government and the southern states got together to create this works project. The Civilian Conservation Corps, California, Oregon, Washington, got together to create these projects. And so that line of distinction is loosened. But, here's the problem. If all three guys are rowing in the same direction, who gets to say what direction? You have the constitutionally defined responsibilities, but this is something new. This is an entirely different animal. Okay. The argument is that you have a hawk and a groundhog. And so this is the idea of fiscal federalism, or federalism when you throw a big bag of money at it. Fiscal federalism, right? The hawk is exemplative of the central government. And by virtue of its position, by virtue of its central authority, the hawk flies far above the nation and can see from horizon to horizon. This is the idea. And so the hawk has a better idea of what's needed nationwide than perhaps the groundhog. Because the poor groundhog can see things very closely, can focus very closely, and can see things very in focus, but can't see over the next speed bump. They can't see in California what's going on in Arkansas. Only the hawk can see that. So the hawk, by virtue of its position, is the one to say, this is the way we're going to row. But then, what the hawk does is it helps promote those programs through the use of money, or through the flow of money in cooperative federalism. And so the hawk gets to say, we need the Tennessee Valley Authority. So California, you're not even going to benefit from the TVA, because we're talking about infrastructure in the South. But by virtue of our tax and spend authority, we're going to draw from the richer states and invest in the poorer states. Right? So this is rowboat federalism. It's cooperative federalism. It's breaking down the dual federalism that existed to the 1930s and replacing it with a new evolved model. Now, the New Deal legislation is often derided by historians, especially those who are suspicious of strong central authority, saying that it was of itself unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court agreed. There were four horsemen of reaction, four Supreme Court justices who, one by one, struck down pieces of New Deal legislation. And we'll talk about that when we get to Chapter 13. It wasn't a done deal. It was very divisive, and it was part of a pluralistic model where the nation came together and talked about, this is our new system. So it wasn't done in a vacuum.
So really, what we're talking about is fiscal federalism, and we'll talk about this a little bit more as we continue into our lecture today. But fiscal federalism, F-I-S-C-A-L, in that federalism as it acts when you throw a big bag of money at it, well, a basic task facing all governments really is amassing the material resources needed to support government programs and operations. In current times, the chief resource of concern is money, although in years gone by, land, conscript labor, and many other commodities have been used by governments to support their activities. In this lecture, then, we examine the growth of taxing and spending by the national, state, and local governments, as well as changes in the relative taxing and spending shares by each level. Fiscal federalism, the growing use of intergovernmental grants, the types of grants, and the goals of grants will be discussed. Grants have numerous effects and are supported and attacked by complex political coalitions. The number of alternatives to grants have been proposed by some of the attackers. Finally, the problem of coordinating the revenue-raising activities of the various governments in the federal system is also to be examined. So, my friends, a clear grasp of fiscal federalism for our lecture today really is essential for understanding intergovernmental relations, everything that we've talked about heretofore. A government that cannot afford to offer programs people desire may find those people taking their demands to other governments. A government that depends on another government for financial assistance may become vulnerable to influence by the funding source. A government that gives substantial financial aid to other jurisdictions may gain influence over how they conduct their affairs.
But the next level is creative federalism, where Lyndon Baines Johnson, the president who came into office on John Kennedy's assassination, tried to use the same model, the New Deal model, to create a great society. In his mind, to address societal problems, not just economic problems, not just the Great Depression, but he created a number of programs in the Great Society under creative federalism, such as Medicare, disability, state children's health insurance, Medicaid, Indian health, food stamps, child nutrition and milk programs, hot lunch programs, education grants, supplemental security income, earned income credit, to try to correct the ills of society and educational and income disparities, to create a great society using the same model, the tax and spend model, that Franklin Roosevelt used. One program that I'm going to highlight is the Older Americans Act of 1965. So we'll come back and we'll use one of these creative federalism acts to examine the bamboo fence and fiscal federalism very shortly. Next, we have competitive federalism. Competitive federalism is, in the words of Ronald Reagan, the powerful harnessing of our tripartite sovereignty, so the central, the states, and the cities and the counties, that allows states to compete with each other over a broad range of issues to provide citizens with the best values and services at the lowest cost. So this is competitive federalism or new federalism. Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson had one thing in common. They were Democrats. And they were coming from the Democratic Party's platform, using the power of the central government to fix societal and economic ills. The Republican platform is a different horse. And they're going to be talking about devolution. Devolution is a term that's in your book, and devolution is going to be one of the terms on your in-class midterm, I'm afraid. So late at night to hit you with this, but there you have it. Devolution is a Reagan-era philosophy, a Republican philosophy, to devolve, to go back, and to let power slide away from the central government back to the states where, in their minds, it rightly belonged. And this is also done through fiscal federalism, through a competitive model. So the hawk still has the money, but instead of using it to correct societal ills by saying, this is what you need, states, I'm going to give you $100,000 for law enforcement, and you're going to use it to hire these many cops, and you're going to buy this many cop cars, and you're going to train them to these standards, and you're going to teach them this, etc. Under creative federalism, competitive federalism says, hey, states, I have a bag of money. We need to use it for care of older Americans. We the hawks see that older Americans need help in our society. What are you going to do with it? Compete for it, says new federalism. And so then the states are able to leverage their tax and spend, their authority over their states and their cities and counties. And for example, California gets to say, okay, for your $197 million that you're willing to give us for older Americans, federal government, this is what we're going to do with it. We're going to compete against Arkansas and Alaska and Hawaii for that same bag of money by telling you that we're going to offer this program, and gee, isn't it cool? And so you're competing for the money. What happens is the citizens benefit. Free market, right? Build a better mousetrap. Show me how you're going to spend this money, how you're going to do away with waste, how you're going to do away with overhead, where you're going to really help the people who are involved, and let the federal government then say, hey, that's a great program, fine, you win here. So, what we're talking about is the bamboo fence model. My last mnemonic, yes, sir.
So basically, it helps states programs who need it the most. sort of. I mean, they're competing against it. They're saying we need this for this because of whatever explanation, but they're saying because of that, they're saying, look, that looks like that part needs the most money.
No. Need comes, thank you, that's a great question. So need comes from creative federalism. We, the central government, are looking at the states and say, you need, who can do the most with the money that I'm offering? You may need it the most. We all need it. It's not a determination of who needs it the most, but who can do the most with the money that we're going to give you. For example, you may need it in Arkansas for older Americans, but let's say one of the things that Arkansas is going to do is that we'll match your $197 million with 50 cents on the dollar. We'll pony up 50 cents. California says, we'll pony up $1. We'll match you dollar for dollar. That's competition. We're willing to put our money where our mouth is and give our citizens the best return for your investment. That's competing. So it really is a difference. Because post 9/11, you had states who were competing for security funds, right? And so you had states like Wisconsin, South Dakota, Montana, who were competing well and getting security money that they really didn't need. I mean, it was pretty obvious that they didn't need it, but they were winning it because they were competing well for it. So I hear you, and it's like, no. Cool, thank you. And so bamboo fence then is perhaps differentiated, if you would, from the picket fence. So this is a picket fence, right? We've seen this. This is dual federalism. This is your layer cake. Now, the slats in the fence, let's say, represent policy issues. Let's say it represents, if you look at it, older Americans. Older Americans is a pretty broad term. What does older Americans help entail? Things like nutrition services, home and community-based services, caregiver support, preventative health services, protection of vulnerable older Americans, aging network supports, Alzheimer's prevention, Medicare patrol. And so we say elder care. What we really mean is that there are individual policy issues involved in elder care. Now, in a picket fence model or in the dual federalism layer cake model, you have the federal government touching these planks and you have the state touching these planks. In a bamboo fence, it's much more interwoven, where you have elements of the federal, the states, the cities, and the counties, and volunteer organizations, nonprofits, participating to provide goods and services overall. Where one steps in and the other, it's hard to differentiate, where one begins and the other ends. So here's my example, right? The Older Americans Care Act of 1965. So we're looking at a creative federalism program, an LBJ Great Society program, with an eye toward competitive federalism in new federalism. The Older Americans Act, 1965, is a fund to create help for the states based on population and based on the number of, or the proportion of elders in a population. California, by virtue of our population and our age, wins about 10% of the funds available through the Older Americans Act.
So from records of the last available fiscal year,
the federal appropriations for this act was $1,369,000,000 and change. And so California gets roughly 10% of this, or $137 million from the feds. In competing for it, it says that it's not going to even match it dollar for dollar. It's going to match it about $1.30. So for every dollar it gets from the feds, California is going to match it with $1.30 of our own. So California is ponying up $194,696,000, right? And so this is part of the competition. You have this money based on proportion, based on population and the age of the population, and this is what we're going to do to compete for that. We're going to add our own money and then some. And so this is California adding $194 million to the $137 million, and it's distributed here. Nutrition, senior community employment, supportive services and centers, senior centers, special projects and administration, adult day health care, Alzheimer's day care, area agencies on aging, brown bag program, foster grandparent program, health promotion, legal assistance, information, medication management, nutrition services, respite program, etc. But wait, it gets better. The counties and the cities are children of the state, wherein at the national level we have a pure federal model, at the state level we have a unitary model. Here's how. Sacramento says that we create Santa Rosa, we create Napa, the city, the county. And they, by our creation, are our children. We have the right to create as in a unitary system, or to do away with, or to meld one into the other. So California, the state, is a unitary system. They can rely on their cities and counties to contribute to the efforts on their behalf. So Napa County is contributing to the efforts of California in the Older Americans Care Act by providing adult protective services, area agency on aging, in-home support services, in-home supportive services, public authority, multipurpose senior service program, public guardianship, public conservators, Meals on Wheels, senior dining programs, referrals and placements, long-term care coordination, senior day activity. So this is money, an effort that's coming up from the county to be added to the money and the effort from the state that's added to the money and the effort from the feds. But wait, anybody ever volunteered to help in an old folks home? Or at a senior center? As a child, same here. Most of what they do is volunteer-based. Meals on Wheels is volunteer-based. Foster grandparent program. So the money and the infrastructure and the coordination, the administration are coming from the county. But what's really happening is the nonprofits and the volunteer core of society is ponying up. So you have Older Americans Care, but really what you have is this, where you have the feds, the states, the counties, the cities, the nonprofits, the churches, the volunteers coming together to provide services to an end. So this is bamboo fence federalism, where there's no distinction. It's much more interwelded. Yes, ma'am.
It's making me think, like in education, for example, the schools get so much money from the federal government.
Yes.
And then you get so much money from the state.
Yes.
And then, then the county brings in the after-school programs, and then the volunteers bring in the mentors. And so
the bulk of the money comes from the county through property taxes, absolutely. But now you bring up a good point. So what you're talking about is creative federalism, because what you're doing is you're using the power of the central government, like standardized testing, is a leftover from creative federalism. Here's how. We think that we're lacking in science and math teachers, says the hawk. And so we're going to give the states money to improve their math programs and improve their teacher credentials for math and for science and technology. If the states determine that they don't want to focus on math because oftentimes it takes away from others, music, art, sports, that the states can say no to the funding. But if they do, they're cutting themselves off. Exactly. And so they continue and they have to do it. The same with standardized testing. In the news last week, California noted for saying we're not going to do the standardized testing or elements of the standardized testing that's required by the federal government. You may have heard this. So is it against the law or is it just unwise? Because really what you're doing is California can say no because it's not a law, it's not being imposed, it's tied to money. It's tied to education funding. So what California is doing is saying, if we forego standardized testing, we're going to forego the money. And it's a lot of money. So it's an expensive decision for California to make.
So now they're adopting common core.
Right.
Cores.
Right.
So is that bringing the money?
No, because that's the state, right, because it's the states determining that this is the direction we want to go now, and we're going to diverge from the direction that the federal government insists that we use. And so we're going to give up the money that goes with it. That's why it's an expensive decision. Exactly. And so this is creative federalism, where the federal government says, "This, I think this is what you need. And unless you play, you're not going to get the money." Exactly. Instead, if this was more of a competitive...
Does it get quite a bit of money for it?
Exactly. Oh, yeah. But now, if this were more of a competitive model, California would say, but we have this new way of looking at things. Let us try this and let us compete for this, right? That would be competitive, and they would actually drive the conversation.
Different testing.
Exactly.
Maybe we'll get supplemental income some other way.
Perhaps. You know, you may not remember, well, some of us may remember, when they imposed the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. And so it was an effort to save gas. And there was, I think it was Montana, it wasn't imposed. You didn't have to take the 55, but if you didn't do 55, you would lose the federal funding for the interstate. You would lose transportation funding from the feds. So, I mean, it's within the right of the state to establish its safe driving speed, its speed limits. That's certainly within its purview. But the central government imposed its will by virtue of the strings attached to money. The states couldn't say no. They couldn't afford to say no. So they had to kowtow, except for Montana, who said, take your money. Sorry.
And so, my friends, that brings us to the end of today's lecture on federalism. Wow, that was quite an exercise in patience on your part. Thank you. You may remember, though, very quickly that in today's lecture, we touched on the political and philosophic context of federalism. We talked a great deal about founders' intent. We talked a lot about Federalist theory. We introduced 3 types of federal systems. We introduced the 6 characteristics which define a federal union. We looked at sovereign powers and their relation to federalism. We looked at models of federalism, including fiscal federalism and bamboo fence federalism. And now we turn back to our seminar question. And you may remember, carrying forward from our previous lecture on Constitution, our seminar question asks, how and why was the Constitution created? What are the main features of government under the Constitution? What conflicts emerged first during the writing of the Constitution and later during the ratification debate? And so you may agree that there was a method to my madness. In the long run, this idea of federalism and the founders' intentional choice of a federal model is inherent in the features of government under the Constitution. It's part of the Madisonian model. And so if we're looking at the structures and procedures in the Constitution, as I suggest, the role of federalism is mightily important. So when you're working on your seminar question for the Constitution, as I suggested in the prior lecture, talking about federalism, specifically Federalist theory, would be very wise. I don't see how you can really talk about the features of government without addressing federalism. Okay, that's it for me. That's it for you. Thank you so much. Again, this is Mike Corrali with Introduction to United States Government Online. Thank you and have a great day. See you next week.